national commemorative ceremony has taken place in the capital, Ottawa, from where the BBC's Barbara Plett-Usher joins us. Barbara, the ceremony has just taken place. How has Canada been remembering the Queen's reign?
Alex, it's a national day of mourning and a federal holiday today, and the commemoration started with a military parade through Ottawa, led by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police on horseback. There was a military honor guard and marching band, and then that service that you mentioned, which is just breaking up, addressed by a number of dignitaries and eminent Canadians. There was Albert Dumont, who is the Algonquin spiritual advisor to the Christchurch Cathedral, where the service took place. There was the former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, who remembered how he and the Queen worked together to try to win support for sanctions against apartheid South Africa from the Commonwealth. There was also the former Governor General, Adrienne Clarkson, who told an anecdote about the Queen, saying that the Queen had once said to her, kind of without any warning, "I will never abdicate. It is not in our tradition. Although I suppose if I became completely gaga, one would have to do something." So that sort of mix of affection and respect.
Barbara, members of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police led the Queen's funeral procession here in London. What does that tell us about the strength of the relationship?
That is very strong indeed. They attended her coronation in 1953, and they conducted a special musical ride performance at that point, and then she became the honorary commissioner, and later in her Diamond Jubilee became the commissioner-in-chief, and as a matter of fact, she is the longest-serving member of the RCMP. She did ask that they be included in the procession, and the 4 horses that were being used were horses that the RCMP had gifted to the Queen. She is also the head of the Canadian Armed Forces, the Commander-in-Chief, so there was a very strong military presence today as both the RCMP and the Canadian Armed Forces were saying goodbye to their boss.
So what next for Canada's relationship with the monarchy and with the new king?
Well, the transition doesn't take any, there's nothing official that has to happen here for the King Charles to become the monarch of Canada. Public opinion is not as favorable toward him as towards Queen Elizabeth. It's also a majority indifferent to the monarchy, really, but there isn't any popular movement to change the system of government. And Canadian officials and politicians who have been speaking, some of them have stressed that the monarchy has been a factor in the stability of the country, and also they have noted that King Charles has spoken about the monarch's relationship with the indigenous peoples. He has visited recently, he has talked about reconciliation efforts given Britain's colonial past, and so they expect him to move forward in some way on that issue.
Barbara, thank you. Barbara Plett-Usher in Ottawa. It was in Kenya, 11 years before independence, that Queen Elizabeth was informed of her accession to the throne. For a short period after independence, she was Queen of Kenya before the country became a republic in 1964. So it was fitting that memorial services were held for the Queen. Among those who mourn the monarch's death in Kenya is Sergeant Kennedy Matonga, who serves in the British Army.
For me, I have a personal connection with her, even though I've never met her, because I felt her loyalty, her service, her commitment was something that made me the person I am. It was an inspiration to me myself, and it was a privilege to actually serve under her, and seeing what she was made me become the better person that I am today.
The colonial era is still regarded with mixed feelings in the East African country, and that is reflected in the reaction to the death of the Queen. Our correspondent Anne Soy is in Nairobi, and she began by telling me about today's official commemorations.
There were 2 events today to follow the funeral of the Queen. I was at the British Army Training Unit in Nanyuki, Central Kenya. The British Army has a base there where they train troops, and they paid their respect to the Queen. There was a short service before the ceremony began in London. I spoke to some of the soldiers who said that they were inspired by her commitment and her service, and saying they felt that she understood them, having members of her family who served overseas in the Falklands and in Afghanistan. They felt a special connection to her, and today they paid their respects. There was also another event in Nairobi at the British High Commission where people gathered to follow the funeral from television sets, and they were also paying tributes to the Queen.
Not everyone paying tribute, though, and there have been some different views as well.
There have been mixed views, and some people have been asking questions about the imperial past, and, people reflecting on that and talking about the stories told to them by their grandparents about, how they suffered during that period leading up to independence. It's important to mention that here in Kenya, in 2013, the British government reached a settlement with the freedom fighters, the Mau Mau, and paid them £20 million, and they set up a monument in their honor in the center of Nairobi. But this is an ongoing conversation, and the events of the past 10 days have rekindled that difficult conversation.
Presumably Kenya will not have quite the same connection to King Charles.
When you speak to people, the Queen was really the Queen of people's hearts, not just here in Kenya, but across the continent. King Charles, it may have a slightly different relationship. So it will be interesting to see how he shapes that relationship. He takes over from the Queen as head of the Commonwealth, and therefore there's already a connection to the African Commonwealth.
And Soy in Nairobi. After the timeless solemnity of the funeral rites for Elizabeth II, the memories are being stored away. The streets of London and Windsor reclaimed for their humdrum everyday reality. After 10 days of hushed reverence, it is perhaps time to draw breath to acknowledge the smooth transition of the crown from one monarch to the next, to consider Queen Elizabeth's legacy and to look ahead. For 70 years, the Queen was the still centre of a fast-changing, unsettling and unsettled world. So, what does the future hold for the monarchy, its new incumbent, and its role in the world? Questions for our London correspondent, Rob Watson, who joins us now. Rob, is there a sense in which Queen Elizabeth became almost bigger than the institution of the monarchy itself, simply because of her longevity and the monumental period to which she lived and reigned? And also, how much of a challenge does that create for the new king?
I'm not sure that she would put it, or anybody would put it, that she somehow was bigger than the monarchy. I think undoubtedly her longevity and personality played a huge part. She was hugely liked, and she had been on the scene an awful long time. But I think perhaps of most significance was that she was clearly not in favour of a so-called bicycling town-sized monarchy. So despite Britain's relative decline over 70 years of her reign, the grandeur of Europe's last great monarchy, I think continued, and actually continues, we saw it today, to dazzle the world. And I suspect that King Charles will continue along those lines, that he won't be in favour of one of those so-called European bicycling monarchies.
What would you say are the abiding achievements of the late Queen, the things that will stand the test of time that she left to her country and to the world?
I think it will be definitely the stability, the continuity, 70 years of great change, and yet she projected through all of this a sort of idealised version of Britain and Britishness to the world, a sort of vision of stoicism, calm and good humour. So I think that is it, that she was this huge ambassador for Britain, this face to the world that people could relate over all of those changing times.
And for King Charles III, he's waited so long to be the king. He's now 73 years old. What do you think his priorities are likely to be?
I think his priorities will be to continue the work of his mother in the following sense, that I think he's going to try and pull off the trick that she pulled off, which was to somehow combine an element of majesty, the sort of majesty that we have seen today, and mysticism of a constitutional monarchy, something that still leaves people in awe, but also to somehow fulfill the role that his mother managed to do, particularly in later years as she got older, of being a sort of a comforting and almost personal figure in people's lives. It's a difficult trick. I'm not sure that Queen Elizabeth knew exactly how to do it right at the start of her reign. It's something that she grew into. You could argue that King Charles knows that his mother is not a difficult act to follow. She is an impossible act to follow. But he would have seen that. He will have seen how his mother grew into that role over the years, from young queen to the sort of grandmother as she was portrayed to the nation. And I suspect that is what he will try to emulate.
And he takes the job in incredibly challenging times.
And this is a country reeling from the war in Ukraine, the sort of sense of uncertainty over inflation, political uncertainty, you name it, we've got it.
Rob Watson, our London correspondent, you're listening to The Newsroom here on the BBC World Service in Extended Edition.
This is the BBC World Service with inspiring and powerful stories from around the world.
The day after I woke up, I see myself still have one opportunity. You can't give up now. This is the only thing that I was thinking about every single morning I wake up.
Everything he does is with like so much emotion and passion and intensity.
Her greatness hasn't been recognized as it should be.
There's a whole story here that needs to be told.
The more I learned about her, just the more amazed I became.
You can see how fast I am. So it's not labor intensive. 52 lines. And each line is representing a week in the year.
Farmers are business people and they understand dollars. They can now start to understand that conservation has a dollar value. It's actually much more than a payment, it's a commitment.
You look after the country, country looks after you.
The BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
This is Alex Ritson with an extended edition of The Newsroom marking the funeral of Queen Elizabeth. In a couple of minutes we'll be in Windsor, where a private burial service is starting, attended by members of the royal family. We'll also hear from some of those who attended the funeral earlier in Westminster Abbey in London. And we'll be live in the United States and Jamaica to find out how today's events were followed there. This is the BBC World Service, live from London.
BBC News with Roisin Hasty. At Windsor Castle, a committal service has been held for Queen Elizabeth at St George's Chapel, 11 days after her death at the age of 96. The Dean of Windsor removed the imperial crown, orb and sceptre from the Queen's coffin before the casket was lowered into the royal vault. The Queen, who reigned since 1952, will be laid to rest later on Monday beside her husband, parents and sister. Earlier, 2,000 people packed into Westminster Abbey in London for the late monarch's funeral service. It was the biggest gathering of world leaders in a single place in living memory. The Archbishop of Canterbury said few leaders had received the outpouring of love seen for Queen Elizabeth. Hundreds of thousands of people lined the 30-kilometre route between London and Windsor to glimpse the Queen's final journey. Tens of millions are thought to have watched the funeral ceremonies on television. In other news, in Iran, at least 2 protesters have been killed during protests sparked by the death of a woman detained by the morality police. There's been sporadic unrest in several parts of Iran since Mahsa Amini's death in custody on Friday. President Biden says difficult decisions were made in order to gain the release of an American citizen in Afghanistan in exchange for an Afghan tribal leader. Mr. Biden granted clemency to Bashir Nourzai, who'd spent 17 years in a US prison on drug smuggling charges. Restrictions have come into effect in Poland, Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia, barring the entry of Russian tourists. Some Russians, such as students, dissidents, lorry drivers and permanent residents of the European Union, will be exempt. And the developers of the best-selling computer game Grand Theft Auto say a hacker has leaked footage from the game's next edition. More than 90 videos and images were posted online. BBC News.
You're listening to an hour-long edition of The Newsroom with me, Alex Ritson. A private burial service for Queen Elizabeth II is taking place in the King George VI Memorial Chapel in Windsor, west of London, where she will be laid to rest alongside her parents and sister and her husband, Prince Philip, whose coffin will be brought there to join hers. Earlier, a service of committal was held at St George's Chapel in Windsor Castle. Crowds of people lined the streets to greet the procession with the state hearse at its heart as it moved towards the castle. In a touching gesture, the late Queen's two corgis, Mick and Sandy, made an appearance, as well as her favourite feral pony, Emma. Our correspondent, Naomi Grimley, is in Windsor. Naomi, an interment service is underway for Queen Elizabeth. Who's there and what is taking place?
Well, this is the most private of all the ceremonies that we've seen today. It is simply for the royal family. It began about half an hour ago, and it will involve the Queen being laid to rest in the George VI chapel. So this is the chapel that her father is buried in, also her mother and her sister, Princess Margaret. And then the coffin of her husband, the Duke of Edinburgh, who of course died in April 2021, he will also be moved from the royal vault to be laid to rest by her side.
Tell us what happened earlier in Windsor.
Well, it was quite an extraordinary sight. I was on the Long Walk, which is this ramrod straight avenue that runs up to Windsor Castle, and it's nearly 3 miles long, and you could see a tidal wave of colour coming towards you, and that was the red of the soldiers' uniforms as they accompanied the state hearse up the hill and back down again and back up, because it weaves up and down this long road. And it was quite an extraordinary sight, but also the sound of pipers and the sound of a funeral march as well after the pipers had finished. So it was a very moving sight, and then as you mentioned, even after that there were touches of very emotional touches, such as her dogs being there to watch as the hearse was brought through to St George's Chapel. There was also a formal service where the crown jewels were taken off the coffin and placed on the high altar. They will next, of course, be used in public at the coronation of King Charles III.
And we thought we could do crowds in London, but the crowds in Windsor were just extraordinary, weren't they?
Yes, absolutely. Thousands of people for as far as the eye could reach, because this long walk is so very long. And it was almost like a race course packed with spectators waiting for the hearse to come up towards the castle. And it has been a very long day, but I think particularly for the royal household, the events at Westminster have had an intimacy that maybe the service at Westminster Abbey didn't quite have. For them, it's been more of a personal touch that we've seen this evening, particularly people who'd worked for her for many years, perhaps looked after her horses in the stables, that kind of thing. It's been a real honour for them to be at this service.
Naomi, thank you. Naomi Grimley in Windsor. Earlier at the service at Westminster Abbey in London, one of those who took part was the Right Reverend Dr. Ian Greenshields, the moderator of the Church of Scotland. Here's part of his prayer.
O God, from whom cometh everything that is upright and true, accept our thanks for the gifts of heart and mind that thou didst bestow upon thy daughter Elizabeth, and which she showed forth among us in her words and deeds.
Afterwards, he gave us his thoughts about the service.
So it was a very dignified service, and at the same time there was what we were all wanting to see, which was a real sense of worship in the Abbey too. It wasn't just something that had to be done, and it wasn't something that was being done by rote. It was something that was being done more by the heart as well. I was amazed that in such a space with so many people, you could have such a dignity and worship too. I think that when the Archbishop spoke today, he spoke about a servant, and that was quite powerful. The way that he started off that whole sermon, he was emphasising she didn't seek power, But there are those who seek power and that ultimately they're forgotten, they're damaged by it. She didn't. She used power in a way that was helpful, beneficial, caring towards other people.
The moderator of the Church of Scotland, Dr. Ian Greenshields. Gathered alongside those who conducted the service were around 2,000 guests, including countless heads of state and foreign dignitaries. Among them were members of the public from around the UK and the Commonwealth who were invited to join the commemoration of the Queen's life. Let's hear from some of them for their reaction to the historic event.
It was a really extraordinary, beautiful service. You were really conscious. There were so many people viewing around the world. But actually, in equal measure, it was such an intimate service, actually being there. I think that was so powerful. The music, particularly the pipes fading away in the distance, that really brought the raw emotion. But equally, the service itself was actually very uplifting, really rejoicing in everything that Her late Majesty had given to us.
The atmosphere was just electric. People were just like in awe of the whole Westminster Abbey. And it was just an amazing experience. As soon as the service started, the whole atmosphere in the Abbey changed. It all of a sudden went really, really cold. There was a different smell that came around. It was really strange and really surreal. An atmosphere that you'll never forget, really.
It came to life. It did live. All my expectations were met, and it wasn't boring either. It went very quickly, very fast. And simply because the Queen and Prince Philip did not appreciate or did not tolerate long services. You can say something quite wonderful shortly without you going on and on and on. They couldn't bear services on and on and on and on.
Some personal insight there from the former Archbishop of York, John Sentamu, who attended the Queen's funeral. Over the past week, South Africa has reacted in a conspicuously muted fashion to the death of Queen Elizabeth. Some South Africans, older ones for the most part, have been quietly mourning her and remembering her unique friendship with Nelson Mandela. But others have chosen to focus, if at all, on the bitterly contested and enduring legacy of Britain's empire. Our correspondent in South Africa is Lebo Diseko.
Been across all of the TV and news channels. The national broadcaster here had special coverage, and obviously our President Cyril Ramaphosa was in the UK. It's not a public holiday here. Many people have been kind of focused on day-to-day issues, but I spent some of the morning and a bit of the afternoon with a group of older people, senior citizens, and they really had that sense of nostalgia and reverence for the Queen, many of them saying that she was incredibly special to them. One lady shared with me that she was 7 years old when then Princess Elizabeth first came to South Africa, and she said she was very sad, and it felt like really an end of an era for her.
I felt very also, and we used to collect photos and everything that you could get of the royal family, you collected it. I was 7 years old when they visited South Africa, and I really feel sorry. I really feel sorry for them. But she was excellent. We were born on the same day. She was very, very special to me. I followed her and her sister for a very long time now. She was full of fun, and that's why she was really special. On Remembrance Day, Charles had just married Camilla prior to Remembrance Day, and we were with the South African group, and we were privileged because we were behind these sort of lines, and the Queen walked past. I could have touched her. I could never believe it.
I mean, the lady that you heard just now was explaining how she'd come to the UK for Remembrance Day, and her brother actually passed away, was killed in the Second World War. So to be
part of a Remembrance Day and See the Queen was something that was so special to her. The woman before that was saying that they shared a birthday with Queen Elizabeth had dressed up to the nines to watch the funeral service. So it really was something that was quite significant for her. I do have to say this was a group of senior citizens that was not necessarily representative of the wider South African population. They were in a slightly wealthier suburb. They were all white. I think that one of the things that has come up over the past week or so has been the conversation, particularly amongst younger black people, but amongst black people, about the relationship with colonialism, the monarchy, and also how we chart a way forward in terms of a relationship as a country with, the former colonial power.
Lebo Diseko. We're listening to the newsroom from the BBC World Service. Roisin has a reminder of the main news.
Queen Elizabeth is being laid to rest at a private ceremony at Windsor Castle. Earlier, a committal service at Windsor followed the late Queen's state funeral at Westminster Abbey in London. Large crowds lined the streets to watch the elaborate funeral procession.
It's been almost 250 years since the US announced its independence from British monarchy, but media interest in the institution remains. President Biden and his wife Jill were among the congregation at Westminster Abbey. But what's the reaction been in the United States? Our correspondent Will Grant joins us now. Will, how much interest has there been? Have people got up early to watch the ceremony?
Yes, certainly some have. Of course, the Queen specifically, and indeed the royal family in general, do continue to sort of fascinate many in US society. I think particularly on this day that people were interested in, I think, partly in the combination of the pageantry of a moment such as a funeral for Her Majesty, and also wanting to make a very personal effort to kind of say goodbye, to commemorate her, and to recognise the years of duty involved a very close relationship with the United States. And I think that was important for those who we spoke to in Washington, D.C.
Was she popular?
She was, I think, always viewed pretty favourably among the American public. Indeed, there was a poll suggesting that she, polled around 70% of people in Americans viewing her favourably. I think she will always be remembered for the fact that the day after the 11th of September 2001, the guards outside Buckingham Palace played the Star-Spangled Banner in a complete break with protocol. And I think steps like this that just showed the Queen had an affection for the United States, that she recognised the relationship between Britain and the US. Obviously came to Washington, met many presidents, dating back all the way through her reign. And I think that will be the challenge for her son. That will be the challenge for King Charles III, to sort of emulate that relationship. It was always solid. It rarely sagged. It rarely slowed. I think that was very, very evident in the commemorance that we've seen among people in the United States.
It is an extraordinary thought that she met President Truman. How well known, though, is King Charles in the US?
Of course he's known, tremendously well. Those who do follow royal affairs in general will know, every member of the royal family, and even for those who don't, they do know who he is. He is a figure on the world scene. I think they may well be a lot of people will be looking for perhaps slightly more politics to come from the royal family under him, and indeed to come from him more personally. And what do I mean by that? Well, the relationship with the British Empire to the colonial nations, and the idea of an apology and perhaps one day reparations. There are many people in the United States who come from nations taken by him.
Will Grant in Washington. Around the world, the death of the Queen and the accession of her son, King Charles III, has been a time of reflection, a time to give thanks for a life well lived in the public service. But that feeling is not universal. In some of the countries which are part of the Commonwealth and where the British monarch remains head of state, her death has given impetus to republican movements. The Himalayan country of Nepal has also paid its respects to Queen Elizabeth. The British Embassy in the capital screened the funeral for veterans of the Gurkha Regiment which has served the British Crown for more than 200 years. A memorial event has been held at a site just outside Kathmandu, where the late Queen planted a tree during her visit to Nepal in 1961. Yogita Limai reports from the capital.
Prayers are being offered at a monastery in Kathmandu for Queen Elizabeth today. Looking through the door of the main prayer hall, I can see rows of Buddhist monks dressed in maroon robes who are chanting mantras or verses. We've seen people light lamps and offer flowers. There's a photograph of Queen Elizabeth in the center, and behind her there are three big statues of the Buddha. And among those attending this prayer service are veterans of the Gurkha regiment of the British military. For more than 200 years, soldiers from the Gurkha region in Nepal have served with the UK military, so there's been a special bond, a special relationship between them and the British